Welcome back to another episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and today's guest is Jeannine Coulter. Jeannine is co-host of the popular recovery podcast, Chasing Heroine. Jeannine has an incredible story of recovery and has nearly 8 years of sobriety. Like many, this seemed like an impossible accomplishment in the previous years. Jeannine's life started off great and was raised in a Christian home with loving parents. But things changed drastically for her when her parents divorced unexpectedly, and it completely wrecked her soul. The years that followed were filled with debauchery, addiction, legal trouble, and more. She even spent some of her final days of mayhem living in an actual doghouse. Today she comes on the podcast to share her story of how she went from her darkest moments to finding sobriety, love, and buying the fitness studio that helped save her life. We dive deep into her story from start to finish and so much more. So let's get this conversation going and welcome Jeannine Coulter to the Adversity Advantage podcast. Jeannine, what's up?
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, man. I'm so excited to be here. I love your show. I'm an actual fan of your show, so I'm super honored to be on it.
Well, I appreciate you listening, and I appreciate all of your kind words and support through the years. And I wanted to get you on here because I think you have an amazing story. I think you've overcome a lot, and I think it's going to inspire my audience tremendously. But I know like one thing recently that has been kind of a bittersweet thing, which I know is going to tie a lot into your story as we kind of unpack that in a little bit, is that you sold your studio. And I know that the studio has been so meaningful in your recovery journey and your sobriety, and it has given you an immense amount of meaning and purpose to rebuilding your life. How does it feel? Like, how has selling the studio felt from like an emotional side, as far as like, do you feel like a part of you is missing? Do you feel like you have to start over? Like, what's going through your mind?
So first of all, thank you for recognizing that. I feel like most people aren't really seeing that it's exactly what you just said. I've been like saying that to people. I feel like a part of me is missing because when I got there 8 years ago, and we could talk about this more later, but I had 19 days off of heroin. I'd gotten out of jail and I was living in a sober living. And not only did I have no things, no like possessions, I had no one. I spoke with my parents and that was it. And so the studio, and I've only just realized this in the past week, not being there. So the studio was my entire life socially, the people that I met there, because anybody I met in my 20s and early 30s didn't want anything to do with me. I had a couple of friends left from high school and that's it. And I went in there with no one and nothing. So it's been my whole world, and it does feel like a piece of me is missing. The one thing that makes it better is that I'm so proud of what we accomplished there. So I was there for 8 years and I owned it for 3. And I'm so proud of what I was able to do with that community just as an instructor for the first 5 years, but then as the owner. And I was telling Doug off air, like the clients that have been displaced have like Facebook support groups for each other. And I just saw one of them this morning and she was like, I think I need to see a therapist. I missed you guys so much. It was my structure and it was ripped away from me and I'm angry. And I'm like, I understand. I'm super proud of all of that. And from a business standpoint, we did really well on the sale. But emotionally, it's a lot. It's a lot. Like you said, I feel a little guilty that it fell apart after I sold it. I didn't think that was going to happen with this particular buyer. So I couldn't have known, but I still feel guilty. And I've known the whole 8 years, they talk in recovery about not being too identified with like your clean time, which I am. I'm super proud of my clean time in particular. And so I know that that's something that, because if you lose the thing or if you get too identified with your work, that can be dangerous. And I've always known I'm very identified with this studio. This is everything that I am. I was always a little bit afraid in the back of my mind that if I lost the studio, like, would I lose my recovery? Would I lose, how would I feel? So yeah, it's been really challenging. It's been 3 weeks of me not going there for the first time in 8 years. But I appreciate the question because it recognizes what it was for me,
Yeah, I appreciate you being honest and sharing all that. And I think people who have struggled with addiction know that when you are struggling with addiction or you're doing drugs or drinking a ton of alcohol or whatever the case may be, it's like this obsession, this ultimate like form of religion, and you begin to create this identity around whatever addiction it is that you have, between who you're spending time with, when you're going to do it, where you're going to do it, like how you're going to manipulate certain people to get that thing that when you get sober or get into recovery, you have to figure out a way to use all that energy that was being used for drugs to something else. And so I can imagine that given what you've gone through and how you put your heart and soul into the studio, that now you have almost like a void inside of you. So with that said, like, what are you doing to nourish and take care of yourself in a way that's positive so that you can start to fill yourself back up internally?
I cleaned the house for the first time in like 8 years because it was a mess because I was focused on the studio, right? So I'm kind of trying to take care of things like that. I hadn't like even cleaned out my car or cleaned the house. So I'm trying to make my home environment a little bit nicer for the first time. I bought some plants and like some crystals and like all the things. I've got this friend who her house is covered in plants and crystals, and it just feels really good when you go there. And I always thought, man, I would love to be like a woman who like made a house nice, and that's just like never been part of my, what I do. So I've been trying to kind of like make the house a little bit nicer. I got a dog. And I'm still working out every single day first thing in the morning because fitness is still my mainstay of self-care, and I'm in such a routine with that. Fortunately, that didn't even, my dad actually called me a few weeks ago, like later in the day, later than we normally speak. And he was like, well, I figured I should call you later than my normal time because he's on the East Coast because you're probably sleeping in now. And I was like, actually, no, I'm not. I'm still getting up at 4:30. Or even Doug this morning was like, why are you on Instagram at 5 a.m? Are you that excited for the show? And I was like, no, I'm getting up and going to a class, So I'm still working out. And I'm going to start ordering, this was something I did before my wedding, ordering the meal prep. They send it to you and you cook it. I'm going to start doing that in the next few weeks. So kind of getting back to like the basics of self-care that I wasn't doing for a really long time, which is partially why we sold it. All of that stuff had long since fallen away. But I love what you said about the obsession. And that's exactly what I did. And that's where I think addiction can be a real advantage. And this is why I was drawn to your show in the beginning. I love the name, The Adversity Advantage, because I think our adversities can be leveraged into not being liabilities, but something that gives us an edge in life. And that's absolutely what happened with the studio. I was obsessed, not just as an addict, as you know, I was a homeless heroin addict for 5 years. And that obsession is day in, day out, avoiding the cops and getting well, right? And finding a space where you can find a vein. And it's a hard way to live for a long time. And I think the studio saved my life when I started working there because I was obsessed from day one. And fortunately, the previous owners really gave me the space to create there. So even though I was just an employee in the beginning, I wasn't really. So all of my obsession went directly to that studio,
Right. That all makes sense. And I want to kind of go back a little bit and bring all this together because we've touched on the studio. You touched on being a homeless heroin addict for 5 years. And I think what might shock some people is that you were like literally like living in a doghouse, like a literal doghouse, not figuratively, like a literal doghouse, like during the tail end of your addiction, right? But I want to go back. I want to go back to like your origin story. I know you grew up in Georgia, senior year of high school, your parents split. As somebody who essentially grown up at that point for the most part, I mean, you were a teenager.
17, yeah.
17 years old. What were you observing? What was going through your mind? What kind of things were you thinking? And then how did that impact you as a teenage girl?
It impacted me a ton. So I had this amazing, and I always tell people this because I ended up, like you said, as a homeless IV using drug addict for a long time. And I always tell people there was like no reason for that to have happened based on my background. Like when you think of an addict, and I let myself off the hook with this for a long time too. I'd go to meetings. I started in CA, Cocaine Anonymous. And so I would see all these crack addicts sharing their stories, and they had these horrific origin stories, and their parents used, and it was like a cycle of abuse and drug abuse, and that's what they'd seen. And I was like, I didn't see any of that. I'm probably not a real addict, like I'm not like that. I had this amazing, amazing childhood. My father's a pilot. My mom has a master's degree in social work. She was our youth minister. They raised us with discipline, but also love, like this amazing supportive home environment for me and my brother, and told us we could do anything in the world, and any college I wanted to go to, I could go to, like the idyllic family. And so when my parents suddenly split, I had no indication, neither did my brother. And what I remember feeling at the time was I felt that the floor had been pulled out from underneath me. I felt like I was falling. And what happened, unfortunately, and I always like to throw in here that this is not my parents' fault, because that's the other thing. My parents are such good people. They're like charitable, giving, kind, loving people. And so nobody would have wanted this to happen, obviously. But I felt tricked. I felt tricked. And I wish I had known back then. I wish I could have identified, like, this is what you're feeling. And, I could have expressed that to somebody. And if, maybe somebody could have course corrected that a little bit. But I felt like I was being fooled. And I felt like the life that I was being sold in terms of, you're going to do what we did, which was, they got married at 19 years old and they both have master's degrees. My dad has a master's degree in aeronautical science, like high levels of education. This is what you're going to do because this is how you live. I felt like all of that was just a lie. And I was like, no, none of that's right, man. Because I watched you two live that way. And now this is what's happening. And so I've been working so hard to get these great SAT scores. And I'm taking 5 AP classes my senior year, early admission to this college. And this is bullshit. This isn't going anywhere. Obviously, I don't need to do any of this. And I very systematically, without realizing it, just took a wrecking ball to my life. And the first thing I destroyed was my academics. And yeah, I felt like I was falling and I felt like I had been tricked, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense, especially if obviously you mentioned that your parents are such good-hearted people, were always very encouraging, very charitable, very kind, got along well. Then all of a sudden you find out they're splitting up and you're like, wait a second, like what just happened? Then your whole world collapses. I can imagine like you were mad at the world. You felt this level of distrust. You're like, why is this happening to me? And then you're like, all right, well, if this is going to fall apart and I thought this was going to be great, then I might as well just self-destruct the rest of my life. So let's unpack that. So you graduate high school and your parents are getting divorced and you've started to experience all these emotions you just touched on. Like walk the audience through as best you can. Like how did that slowly start to impact other areas of your life?
So I remember thinking, well, I don't want to play by the rules anymore, right? I've been playing by the rules for like a long time. And I had friends that would drink in high school and smoke weed. And I never did any of that because I had this respect for my parents' lifestyle because they very much walk their talk, right? Like never saw them drink. They don't even cuss, and I wasn't interested in doing any of those things genuinely, like not out of a fear, but out of like a, no, almost like not, I'm above that in an arrogant way, but like, I have the maturity to see that this is going nowhere and I want to go to law school. What I actually wanted to be was I wanted to be the president. I wanted to be the first president of the United States. And I had a path to that, right? Like I debated in high school. I was really good at debate. I was going to GW in Washington, D.C. I was going to go to law school, come back to Georgia and start running for office locally and build. Like I had a path to the presidency at 17 that I had mapped out. And I just thought, if playing by the rules got you two here to this horrible place, what have I been doing? Why have I been playing by the rules? And the first way it manifested, which is interesting, is in the way that I looked and dressed. So I looked like a very conservative young 16, 17-year-old. I wore that was like the Abercrombie sweater vest. Like in my senior picture, I'm wearing like a sweater vest with like a button up. And yeah, just dressed very conservatively. And I don't know why this exactly happened, but the first thing I started doing was changing how I dressed. I cut off all my hair, bleach blonde my hair, and started dressing really provocatively. Like they would pull me into the office at school and be like, what are you doing? Like knee-high boots and short skirts and cleavage. Like that was the first thing that happened, was I like completely changed my outward image. And then I started skipping school. I still graduated, but I think a lot of my teachers who knew what was going on because it was a small town kind of passed me through the second half because I'd already gotten into college. So that was how it started. It started with the change of my appearance, and then it started with, blowing off classes. And it's kind of fun to blow off classes, actually. Like when you're that young, I'm like, what have I been doing? Like I'd rather go to Ruby Tuesdays and smoke a cigarette in the parking lot at noon and sneak back in than sit there like a good girl. This is actually really kind of fun. And I was working at a restaurant. And I started dating my 22-year-old boss, even though I was 17. Started doing that and just kind of started down initially all like the typical teenage rebellion things. I still went to college. I still went to GW. And when I got there, though, I just did not have it in me. Looking back, I was really sad. I was really depressed about what had happened. And it's hard when you're depressed to really do anything. And I was so depressed I couldn't really go to class, and I wasn't completing homework assignments. I wasn't doing anything. And so after a semester, I didn't actually fail out. I got like, I don't know, a 2.5 average, say, after the first semester, but I wanted to leave. It was clearly not the right place for me. I didn't fit in at all, and I was kind of falling apart on the inside, and I just wanted to be back at home. So I left, and you know some of this, I left GW and went back home to the University of Georgia, and that pattern followed me, though. I couldn't make it work there either because it wasn't the location, it was me. You know, I was too depressed to go to class. I also didn't really, and this is something I started to unpack later as I got more involved in recovery and learned a little bit more about addiction. Yeah, I was depressed. But also, I think there was a part of me that was always there that didn't really want to work that hard because I hadn't had to work that hard in high school. You know, I was naturally able to get good grades, and college is harder than high school. Like, it is. And it requires some discipline to get up early. And at University of Georgia, you have to take this bus to a parking garage and all this stuff. And I didn't want to do any of that, you know? And so I think it was a combination of being depressed and sad. And then also some of my not play by the rules nature that had always been a part of me started to kind of come together and resulted in me quitting school, basically.
You mentioned cutting off your hair, changing your appearance, like cutting class, doing all this stuff. Like looking back now, knowing what you know about yourself and about the situation, do you think in a way it was just like a cry for help? Like you wanted to get some sort of attention or validation because inside you were really hurting because you felt like you had been lied to by the two people that you love the most in your life, and that you had this goal of like essentially like being like them, and then that all kind of falls apart, and now you're sitting there in a way a little bit broken. So do you think that some of that behavior was just a way for you to get some attention that maybe you weren't getting anymore at home?
Probably. I do think there was a part of me that, and this was like really far from the surface. This was nowhere near the surface. So my father is like the most important person to me in the world still. Like I've already mentioned him on this interview, you know, like my favorite human being. He's amazing. And I think there was a part of me that wanted him to change his mind and thought that, but I did not think this at the time. At the time I was like, I support you. I love you. I want you to be happy. That was how I felt. But I'm sure there was a part of me that was maybe trying to get him to change his mind, you know, by dismantling the things that they were proud of, you know, but that didn't feel conscious at the time. At the time, I felt like, no, this is who I actually am. I remember thinking when I graduated, if I could go back and do things differently, I would party more, actually. Like, I would study less and party more. And I feel like most people, as they're adults, say the opposite. They're like, well, maybe if I could go back in time, I would have done better in school. And I'm like, no. I would have partied more. I would have blown off more school. That was stupid. None of that was real. I remember feeling that way.
Right. Well, and that makes sense too, because you felt like you were lied to. Like you lived this one way and you thought it was going to end up follow the same path as your parents, get married young, have kids, raise a good family, like live a good life. And then you found out that you living that way, like you behaving in the way that you were behaving, like didn't work. Like your parents split, your world comes crashing down on you. And in a way, it seems like you kind of were just on this path of self-destruction, saying just screw it. Like I've been lied to, like I already know that my life isn't going to end up the way that I was told it was, because look what just happened with a divorce. And now look at what's happening in my life. And now you start to, in a way, like stack all these things on top of you, and you start to validate yourself because you use some of these situations, not you, but I'm just saying you as like in a general way, these situations to justify like other like unhealthy behavior. And it all comes back to that one thing.
Yes. And that happened, right? I ended up moving to LA. And as I got more into drug use.
So what took you to LA?
So I changed my mind and wanted to be an actress instead of being the president. Also, both of those goals are, I think, a little bit clues into what I believe later as part of having like an addictive personality. Those are giant attention-seeking goals. Wasn't necessarily my aim to be the president to get attention, but kind of I wanted to be famous, you know? So, and it didn't come out of nowhere. I had done a little bit of acting as a kid, actually, but not for a very long time. And I just didn't want to keep going to school. I didn't want to finish, and I wasn't going to finish, like clearly. And so I decided to move to LA and give acting a shot. And I really believe I really believed that I would become like a famous actress, like quickly. And it's like a country song. This is true. With $600 in a cowboy boot, this is true. I drove cross country to LA at 22 in my little Saturn and started to try, you know what I mean? Started trying to be an actress, which I'm kind of proud of now. Like, in a way, I'm like, my God, that was silly. Oh, you probably should have finished school. You were right there. But at the same time, I'm kind of proud that I took that chance. But that's what brought me to LA.
Right. So you end up at GW. It ends up not working out there. You go to UGA. Same kind of patterns happen with you in your educational career. And then you decide on a whim you're going to go out and, go to Hollywood and become an actress at 22. So you get to LA. Like, what's that process like? Are you still processing some of the stuff from your parents' divorce? Are you not even worrying about that yet? Have you started to experience with any drugs? Like, where are you at right there at that point with your mental health?
So I was still obsessed with my parents' divorce. I was obsessed with my parents' divorce until very recently. It colored everything I did, like the sadness around that. Now, I think at some point I started to actually just use that as a way to excuse my drug use. But in that point, I was still very much living in like the sadness of it. But I had started to do a little bit of coke in Athens. I had started to do a little bit of cocaine at Georgia. So I was bartending. The last year I took off of school to just try to save up money to move. So I had started doing coke at Georgia and I loved it. And I remember the first time I did coke, and I'm a 12-step person, and sometimes at meetings when people talk about drinking for the first time, often they'll say something like, man, the first time I drank, I knew I felt so good. And that's not how I felt when I drank, that's not how I felt. But I can relate to that with doing coke. The first time I did cocaine, I remember thinking, oh my God, I can do this. If this is life, if this is how other people feel, I can do this. I can't really do that other thing. But I can do it if I feel like this. And I was like a nicer bartender because I was like not a very happy bartender. I'd be sitting there like smoking cigarettes, like taking forever to like make people drinks and just being obnoxious behind the bar. I worked at this like frat bar. I was the only girl that worked there and I was so obnoxious about all of it. But so it made me like a good bartender. I was nice. I was happier. But I had never bought it at that point in time. I never bought it. It was just like the guys would have it and share. And I never really talked about this much. But this was such an early sign of my addiction because I'd done coke, let's call it 20 times, right? Moved to LA. I'm there for 2 months and I got a job waiting tables, but I didn't know anyone to find any cocaine. And I wasn't saying that out loud, obviously, to anyone. But if I'm being really honest, like that was like in my head all the time. And I decided actually after the first 2 months to go home. I was going to go back. And so I made hotel reservations back across the country to leave. And like 2 nights before I was going to go back, I was out on Mulholland Drive I did have one friend that already lived there and his roommates. And I said something about being really tired. And he said, well, I got something for that. And I was like, you do? Okay. And he had some coke on him. And I went back to the house. And that next day, I changed my mind and I decided to stay in LA. And I told everybody it was because I felt like, oh my God, I got to take a chance on myself. How could I possibly walk this back? But really, and I didn't admit this until I was like a decade later, longer than that. But really, it was because I found a connection. And I thought I was going to leave without that connection. So then my coke use got really, really, really bad. My first 6 months in LA, it was really, 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 really bad. Doing it all night, going like almost broke on it. And the guy lived there. The connection lived at the house. And so I ended up needing to leave from that house. And my brother had to loan me money. Now I was working the whole time and driving and I've said in, one of my things that you've listened to, there's a huge difference between coke bad and heroin bad. So this was just coke bad. I had a car, I had a job, I had a bank account, but things weren't good. And I certainly wasn't progressing in any way. So I left that apartment. And the next 3 years, I didn't do any cocaine. And I used that for a long time to say I'm not really an addict because I quit for 3 years. But I realized later in a rehab that I didn't quit. I started smoking weed, a lot of weed, and drinking. And so I just switched. But that wasn't like a period of clean time. But it went in my brain as a period of clean time,
Yeah. I want to back up for a second because you said something that kind of struck me that I want to unpack a little bit. So you talked about how much your parents' divorce like wrecked you for a long time, like emotionally and mentally, and it was something that you obsessed over for quite some time. So you end up going to Georgia after GW. I can imagine that you're feeling pretty low about your life and about the divorce and everything, given what you shared a few minutes ago. We know that Coke is like a massive stimulant and upper, right? So do you think that you just were at a place in your life where you needed something to bring you back to some level of baseline that you hadn't had for some time because you were so down about what had happened in your life that you doing Coke was like, oh my God, like I feel somewhat normal again. And then that became addicting, right? Do you think that you were addicted to the feeling that Coke gave you? Or do you firmly believe that if the divorce didn't happen, if everything had worked out the way it was supposed to, that you still would have been addicted to drugs?
I think that I still would have ended up being addicted to substances at some point, even if all of those things had worked out. I think that it probably would have manifested differently because say I had gone down like the law school path, I probably would have ended up drinking too much later. I believe that that was always going to happen because doing the Coke didn't get me back to a place that I was. It got me higher than a place that I was, right? Like I was always kind of, and this is something I realized later, even though I was successful academically, I wasn't a very happy kid. And I always felt less than everyone. I felt, chubby and ugly and nerdy and, and so Coke didn't bring me back to a pre-divorce level. Coke brought me to a place I had never been. And it seemed to be like where other people lived all the time. It made life feel more manageable, and life kind of never felt manageable to me. Even though I did do well academically, I was always like, even when I was in high school, I was always running late. I was always this is so obnoxious. I used to do this. I would be really late to school. I would do an illegal maneuver, like at this red light. I would always stop at Chick-fil-A in the morning first, which would make me late. So even though I did well academically, I was also living under my parents' house. And so I still think there was a lot about me that was actually really unmanageable. It just hadn't shown itself yet because I was living at home, because I was a teenager. So I think I was addicted to that feeling, though, of feeling like, yeah, if this is how people feel, I can operate this way,
Right. I mean, do you think it was also like partly like the forbidden fruit syndrome to where you kind of grew up, it seems like in a fairly sheltered house to where you didn't experience the partying, so to speak, that other kids did. And you mentioned your mom was a youth minister and they don't cuss, like all these things to where you were probably like, pretty sheltered. Like, do you think that you also felt this urge to be a rebel in some way because you felt like you had to abide by these rules so strictly?
Absolutely. I really glamorized the drug use life. When I saw Casino for the first time, I don't remember how old I was, but when I saw Casino, Sharon Stone, Ginger, in that movie, I was like, I want to be that lady. I want to do cocaine and wear fur. Now, unfortunately, I became all the way to the end of the motel room, but I just wanted to be her in the first part, But I totally, absolutely glamorized a life of like drug use and partying before any of that happened. I did feel that way for sure. I'm sure that that was part of it. I also felt a lot of guilt around it at the time because I was raised in a Methodist Christian household. And I remember after nights of doing cocaine, I remember feeling like God would be like so disappointed in me. I was like in the shower, being 22, and I was like, I'm so sorry, I'm not going to do that again. And of course I did. But yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that that was part of it.
All right. So let's go back to where I guess you kind of left off with your story. So you're in LA, you have met this guy, and you're now more addicted to Coke, and you convinced yourself that you're going to stay out there for some time to pursue acting, but really you found this connection that you didn't have before and you felt this sense of safety. Where does that lead you? Like, how did you go from somebody who was like, yeah, I'm just going to be clean from Coke for 3 years. I'm just going to smoke a little bit of weed and drink or whatever. Like, how does that lead you to living in a doghouse, shooting heroin?
So I moved out from there, smoking weed, moved into another relationship and picked Coke back up again. So towards the end of living in LA, I started doing cocaine again, heavier than I had the first time. As bad as those 6 months were, I was able to stop on my own. And this is the progression of addiction too, right? It's progressive. And so when I started again at a higher rate, right? At a higher level of intensity, spending money on it now. And I was in a relationship. I lived with somebody who was super upset with me all the time for doing Coke. And I wasn't supposed to be doing cocaine. And the last 3 years of my living in LA just got worse and worse and worse. And then I did start to see some of like the stereotypical addict problems. Like my car blew up, all the head gaskets on my car blew up because I wasn't ever spending money to get the oil changed on my car because I was buying Coke. And then my boyfriend didn't want to live with me anymore and he kicked me out. And I moved somewhere else and I'm like always about to get fired and, you know, all of the things, I'm losing money. So it ended up getting so bad. I couldn't keep a job. It's also very hard to take public transportation in LA. You can't realistically not have a car there. It got so bad I had to leave. And my mom actually lived in San Diego. So at 29, it was so bad in LA, I had to go move in with my mom in San Diego. And initially the goal there was to just be there for a few months and go back to LA. And when I got there and I got a little space and a little clarity, I thought, what am I doing up there? You know, also by then I had found fitness. I had found teaching and I was really more into, it was so weird. I loved teaching way more than my dream of acting. And when I got down to San Diego, I got this amazing job, like pretty quickly making a lot of money at a really nice resort. And I was like, you know what, if I'm honest, even if I like booked a pilot, I would rather teach these spin classes, you know? So that dream had started to come up too. So that had actually happened in LA. At 26, I quite accidentally got certified to teach spin. So now that had come into the mix of my life and I loved that.
So you're living with your mom, you're in San Diego, you're teaching fitness at a studio. And a lot of times in recovery, fitness is the catalyst to make these drastic changes that often need to be made to take some negative habits, some negative energy and turn it into something positive. And at the same time, fitness is a great tool to, you know, help with anxiety, depression, stress, all those things. But for you, I know that wasn't the case. So talk about how your drug use escalated even as you were a fitness professional.
So I don't know that it wasn't necessarily the case. I still think my teaching and working out mitigated some of the effects of my use, right? It also allowed me to feel like I wasn't really that bad, you know? Like I'm teaching spin. I can't be that bad. I'm not really a drug addict. I'm teaching spin, you know? I'm teaching bar. I'm picking up these certifications. So they were able to kind of coexist for a little while it was still Coke. I was able to do both. And again, it really primarily served a space for me to be like, I'm not that bad. I'm not that bad. And then, you know, mitigate some of the damage because I would be healthy for a week and then go back off the rails. But when I first moved to LA, I quit doing Coke because I didn't know anybody down here. Also, the Coke in San Diego sucks. That was the main reason. I found it a few times and I was like, I don't like this. So I kind of quit doing it. But again, I kept drinking. I didn't completely quit doing substances. And later that was like, no, I've quit doing Coke multiple times. And it's like, that's not really true though, because you kept drinking, you know? So I was drinking, teaching, and kind of doing okay, actually. And then I met a guy. And unbeknownst to me, this guy I don't really know completely. He was certainly he had been addicted to opiates in the past, which he told me. And I'm not sure when he started using again during the course of our relationship, but at some point he started using again. And I remember there was a few times I was over there and he was so out of his mind high and I didn't recognize it. It was like cross-eyed, falling over. And I was like, this isn't Coke. This isn't drunk. I don't know what this is. And I would ask him and, oh no, I'm fine. And then I'll never forget when kind of how this all started. My grandfather had died. I was out of town and I couldn't get in touch with him for a few days. And I was like, this guy's cheating on me. I know he's cheating on me. So we fly back from Florida and I drive all the way out to his house and I'm like busting through his door and his roommate's like, don't go back there. And I'm like, yeah. And I go back there and I kick his door open and I like know what I'm going to see. And I kick his door open and it's all wrong. Like the lights are off. There's like a haze of cigarette smoke in the air. It smells like throw up and weed. And there's like pizza boxes everywhere and no girls. And he's just laying there. And he didn't even get up or like jump when I came in. And we've been together for like a year and a half at this point. And he just kind of looked at me and was like, oh, hey, you're back. And I was like, yeah, man, I've been trying to get in touch with you. Like, what the fuck? What's going on? And he was like, I don't feel good. I don't feel good. I think I have the flu. And I was like, okay, well, man, I was worried about you. Okay. So I like sit down with him. This is so embarrassing. This is kind of how obnoxious I was. Also, again, part of why I believe that I had like the whole addict personality thing going on, even when it wasn't that bad. I then got mad and I was like, well, you didn't answer me. So you made me drive here. So you need to go put gas in my car. because it's your fault that I drove here, because he lived like 20 minutes away. And he said, all right, I'll put gas in your car. So we drive to the gas station and he's just like really quiet, looking out the window, and his card got declined for like $10 worth of gas. And then I tried $5 and his card got declined for like $5. So I put some gas in the car and I went back and pulled up in his driveway. And I will never forget this conversation as long as I live. I looked at him and I was like, look, I love you. And like, obviously something is going on with you. If you've started taking pills again, it's okay. Like, you can tell me. I used to be a drug addict too. I said that. And I was like, I can help you. I've kicked cocaine all these times. You know, I'm not going to like leave you. Can you just tell me what's going on? And he said, yeah, there is something going on, but it's not pills. And just before I tell you this, I just really want you to know that I'm very sorry. And I wanted to do it different with you. Like, I didn't want to do it like this. And I said, okay. And he said, I am on something. I'm on heroin. And I was like, what? Heroin? And I thought all the things that someone thinks when they hear heroin, you know, it's like the worst one. You know, it's the scariest drug. You know, it's like needles and HIV and homeless people and like that movie Train Spotting, you know, like all of the things. I thought all of that too. And I was like, holy shit. So he gets out of the car and he's walking inside. And as I watched him walk inside, I still remember like in my body right now how I felt. I remember him walking away. He had done a couple of tours in Afghanistan and he'd had this horrible life growing up and all this trauma. And as he walked in the house, I remember thinking like, I'm not going to just leave him now. You know, like he needs me. So I got out of the car and I was like in the room by the time he got there and I like fell in the bed with him and I was like, I will help you. Let me help you. And he said, okay. And my naivete at the time is so crazy. I was Googling. So then he told me that he was trying to quit while I was gone. And that's why he was sick and not on the phone. So I'm Googling, like, how do you help somebody kick heroin? And I'm like getting him chicken soup. And now, of course, I know that you can't do anything when somebody's kicking heroin, as you know, or kicking opiates. So at some point, so he quit. And the next day I talked to him and he's like, yeah, I'm feeling a lot better. And he sounded better. And now I know that obviously he just got well the next day. He got heroin. But I didn't know that. And I'm like, oh, good. So the weeks progress. He's obviously still using. And I wish I could remember the exact like conversation or what made this happen. But we were drinking together because we got drunk together all the time. And I walked into the bathroom and he was smoking heroin in there. And I was like, okay, look, if it's that awesome, just let me try it. And he said no at first. And I was like, look, it's fine. I was a coke addict before and I'm not anymore. I'll be fine. I'm not going to get strung out. Just let me try it. And I did. And I tried it that night. And I actually really didn't like it. Well, that's not true. It gave me the feeling of coke. It was like a euphoric feeling. It was an energetic feeling. I was choreographing new bar work. The next day I would have a really bad headache, but I wasn't doing it super consistently at first.
So I guess just to recap what you said, you're in San Diego, you're teaching at the studio, you end up not doing coke, but now you're kind of drinking with this guy who is a former opiate addict. You find out that he's essentially relapsed and that it's now a bit worse than maybe it was before. Now you've begun to try it and you kind of get a little taste of what it feels like. So how does that progress to you like ending up homeless, like living in a doghouse and essentially like, you know, in a place where your life was going to either end or it was going to get better? Like how did that all progress?
So I didn't know. I really didn't know. I don't know if you knew. I didn't know that if you did opiates, you got sick. I didn't know that. I didn't know that you got dope sick. So I must have done it, right? Like every day for 3 weeks or a month. And there was one night when I wasn't going to go out to his place and I started feeling kind of sick. And I called a friend of his who lived closer to me and said, yeah, I was going to take a Pilates class, but I don't think I'm going to because I don't feel good. And he said, Jeannine, you're dope sick. I said, I'm not dope sick. And I'd heard the guys talk about it, but I was like, I'm not an addict. Like you guys are like obviously addicted. I'm not. So I'm not dope sick. And he said, well, I tell you what, why don't you come over here and smoke with me and we'll see. And of course I was like, sure. So I went right over there and I even brought my own straw and he handed me one and I was like, nope, I don't want to get you sick. And I remember he just looked at me like so sad and was like, okay. And I, smoked a little bit of heroin and I immediately felt better. And I looked at this guy who I really liked a lot of all of my ex's friends. This guy and I were like pretty close. And I was like, so what do I do? Did I really just accidentally get strung out on heroin? Did I just accidentally get strung out on heroin? Is that what you're telling me just happened? And he was like, Jeannine, I was like kind of trying to tell you. And I was like, well, not really though. I didn't know that this was going to, so what do I do? And he was like, I mean, you could kick. And I was like, what does that mean? How long does that take? And he was like, I don't know, a couple of weeks. And I said, I have to teach. I have to go to work. I can't take 2 weeks, And he was like, well, then I guess you got to go buy more. And I was like, I have to go buy from a heroin dealer? Like, how much does it cost? And he was like, $20. And I was like, oh my God, I guess give me the guy's number. And fascinating, the person in my story that was crucial later when I got clean was this person I was about to meet, my first connection. And I was like, is he dangerous? And he was like, no, he's really cool. And I was like, oh my God, well, tell him I have to come buy some heroin. And it was like insane to me that this was happening. So I started buying it that day and didn't ever want to kick, right? And my entire motivation for continuing, like many people's, is that I didn't want to be sick and not go to work. I didn't want to have to kick. In the 10 months, it took me 10 months to get homeless.
So where was your family in all this? Like, I know you were close with your family. You've mentioned that your dad is like your best friend. Like, did they have any idea what you were going through?
No. So my dad knew that I'd had a coke problem in LA, and that's why I left. He knew that. But I really didn't want him to know a lot of detail around that because I just didn't want to let him down. So he didn't know how bad it was. And he lives in Georgia. He wasn't here. My mom lives here in the town that I lived in. And she didn't know either because I was still teaching. I lost a bunch of weight, but I still had a job and my car. And then things started to drastically decline. And I actually at one point told her how bad it was and that I needed to maybe go to rehab. And then a few days later, she brought it up again. And I was like, no, I'm fine. I don't actually need to go. This was like a month before I was homeless for the first time. So she kind of knew what was going on and was concerned, but I was still holding it together enough that no one really knew. So, and the way that I ended up homeless was my roommate was getting more and more pissed off at me because my ex was not allowed in the house. They knew each other and he didn't like him and didn't want him in the house. And I was sneaking him in through a window and my roommate knew. Also, the guy that picked me up from the doghouse later, same guy. So he's been an amazing person in my life. And we stole some things from him. We stole a PlayStation and some other things. And he kicked me out. He gave me until the end of, I remember it was February. He gave me until the end of February. And the last week that I was there, my ex woke up early before me and took my car and got arrested. And the car got impounded. So the car was impounded and I didn't have a place to live. And boom, I'm homeless for the first time.
And what year is this? 2012, 2013?
This was 2011. Yeah, this was 2011. And that's how it happened, And then, of course, I can't get to work. But I had already started losing jobs, too. I smelled like cigarette smoke. I was bringing him with me to places. And I taught at really nice places. And he's covered in tattoos, bald head, wife beater, smoking in these country club parking lots. And people are like, Jeannine, you can't bring this guy, but they can't really say that. So I was starting to lose jobs anyways. I was down to one job. I actually tried to ride my bike to it the first day that I was homeless. And I think I did teach. And then I had a court date the next day because I had gotten into a fight and I had a court date for a restraining order. Somebody's getting a restraining order against me. So the next day I called out because I didn't want to tell her I had a court date. And by the way, when you start getting into this world, things like that start happening, right? I'm going to court for a restraining order from some girl. I'd gotten in a physical altercation with this person and none of this was in my experience with coke. This was a deep dive into the addict level criminal lifestyle. So I lost that job. And then from then on, so from at that time, February of 2011, I was homeless.
What does that mean? Where you were literally living outside?
Sometimes. So I was either homeless living outside or living in my car. I got that car back briefly for a few months, or living in the car, or I would be in jail, or I would be in a state program, like a facility program, like a state-run program, until February of 2015.
What I want to know is what was the day-to-day like for you as somebody, now you've got this bad heroin habit, you're homeless, you're boyfriend is getting arrested, you're losing all these jobs. What is the day-to-day like for you as far as how did you, now get money to get heroin? What did that all look like for you?
So there's a bunch of different hustles that you can do as a small time little criminal. So, and you just kind of develop the things that you're good at. So like one of my big hustles was I would go to Walmart and I would steal printer cartridges because they're small but expensive, and go into the bathroom, pull out the little sensor, walk them outside, re-glue them, bring them back, return it for credit. And then you get a credit that you can trade. A lot of connects will take a Walmart gift card, or you can take it to the mall and get half the value in cash. I would steal golf balls, and like really nice golf balls, and sell them to rich guys at like gas stations for less than they cost. So every single day, now whether or not I happened to like find a motel room or I was in the car or just outside, every single day, I would always leave myself enough to wake up with in the morning. Always, which a lot of addicts don't do that, but I always left myself, they call it a wake up. I always had to wake up in the morning. And by the end, the first hour of the day is spent trying to find a vein. So before you do that, you have to find a spot where no one can see you.
So vein isn't because at this point you're shooting up, right?
Yes. Yeah. So at some point I progressed from smoking to shooting. The guy, my ex, we both went to rehab for a little bit. He went to jail for like 3 months. We got out. We both started using again. And he decided that my tinfoil, it leaves black marks all over your hands. He decided that my tinfoil was messy and was going to get us arrested. So we had to start using needles exclusively. And I want to make really clear, though, here that none of this is his fault. I could have left that day, right? I could have left that day. And I spent a very long time blaming him for all of this. He made me use needles, whatever. I had to volunteer for that, So by the end, I was homeless and alone. So for a lot of it, he was with me. But then at some point he moved and I was alone as a woman, shooting heroin. And sometimes I had a bike. I would steal a bike from someone's yard. And so every day would look like that, right? You try to find a vein first. You have to get well. And then it also depended on how bad I had picked my face. So if I had picked my face really, really bad, I couldn't really steal anything because then they're going to watch you when you go into stores. So it was just like this nightmare game daily of, do I look okay enough to walk into a CVS and steal something? I would also say that I had run out of gas. I did that a lot. I would walk up to people with a gas can and I had some keys that I had found and act like my car was around the corner. So just little hustles like that to try to get well every single day. Sometimes I didn't have a phone. Sometimes I did have a phone. And then interspersed with periods, sometimes I would get into a rehab and then I'm always dodging the cops. And I got arrested 5 times during that period. And the charges got increasingly worse too, right? So my last arrest, my final arrest was for strong arm robbery. I think I told you this when we were on the phone once. My final arrest was for strong arm robbery. And they were going to give me like a strike and send me to prison. And that was my last arrest, which was still about 1.5 years before I got clean. But that's kind of the cycle. That's what starts happening when you're...
How did you get out of that as somebody who was broke, like living on the streets? Like, how did you get out of like a strong arm robbery?
Well, so I to this day don't know what happened. So I got arrested and they brought me to court and I was so sick from kicking heroin. I was so sick. I remember being on the bus in handcuffs and I remember saying, "Can you pull over?" to the bus driver. And I knew one of the girls from my rehab and she leaned up, this girl, Viviana, she leaned up and she was like, "Mija, they're not going to pull over. You need to shut up." And she was like, "The girls are getting really mad at you." And I was like, ugh, and I'm like slumping against the thing. So they take me to jail and I didn't see the judge that day. And I didn't know what that meant. I was just laying on the floor with my face by the grate. So we get back in the bus and the same girl was like, "Hey dude, they did you a dry run. They're going to let you go." And I was like, "No, they're sending me up to prison." I talked to the guy because they had also pulled me out for an interview because they thought my ex was stealing and selling guns. So they had pulled me out into a separate room for an interview like more than once, which didn't go anywhere because I was out of my mind. And I had these turtles that they had taken and I was asking about my turtles. Like the transcripts of that must be insane. Like this crazy girl handcuffed to the thing and they're asking me about guns and I'm asking about turtles. Like I was just out of my mind. I had dreadlocks in my hair. Anyways, so on the way down, she says they did a dry run. They're going to let you go. And I'm like, "They're not going to let me go." And that night at like 10:30, Coulter, roll up. And I was like, "What?" And I left, called my mom. She actually did come get me. And as I was signing out, the guy said, "We've got 1 year to press charges. We have 1 year to indict you." And they never did. And so I have no idea what happened with that charge. I have no idea what happened with that charge. And I thought for a long time that maybe it was because the merchandise wasn't valuable enough to warrant that charge. But like 6 months later, I was in a sober living and I had a record. I was out on bail when it happened for commercial burglary, for printing fake checks. And I was like, I'm fucked. 6 months later, I met a girl in a sober living. She had done literally the exact same thing I had done, where I had done it, the same mall. And she had just gotten out of prison. They gave her 8 months. And so I was like, well, and it was about the same value of charges. So I don't know what happened with that. I've never fully understood what happened with that.
So you kind of skipped over like some of your criminal history. So did you ever, like you mentioned you went to jail, like did you just go to jail for a day? Like you said like strong arm robbery obviously is something that's pretty serious. You mentioned commercial burglary. Like these are all things that I would imagine could potentially land you in jail. Like how did you end up like getting out of that where you didn't serve serious time?
So my first arrest was just for DUI, right? Bailed out. Second arrest was for a violation of that DUI. Didn't finish the MAD classes. Bailed out, finished the MAD classes. This was when I sold a car. I was strung out on heroin, but I sold a car. My third arrest was for domestic violence. And that I pled down to, that was a big one too. They were charging me with felony domestic violence, and they had me on video hitting my boyfriend. That I pled down to disturbing the peace and had to pay a fine that I, of course, never paid. The one after that that one was bad. It was printing fake checks, all this stuff. They pled that down to commercial burglary. And I was supposed to be a fourth waiver, but they didn't fill out the paperwork right, so I actually wasn't a fourth waiver. And then that last one, they didn't press charges. So wow. I don't know. Yeah. So, you're absolutely right. All of those stacked up should have resulted in jail time. The more I got deep into the criminal world too, somebody told me once, the bail charge, I was out on bail. The guy was like, dude, they were too close, right? Like you had just gotten out of jail on the burglary. So the robbery, if they'd seen that, they would have pressed charges. And he was like, but it was only like 3 weeks and it kind of takes a while to catch up. He was like, I guarantee you the prosecutor or the judge didn't see that you were on bail for that.
Yeah, because I heard you say, you're like, yeah, I was, strong arm robbery, and I ended up like kind of getting off. And like before that, it was commercial burglary. I'm like, wait a second.
Yeah.
Wait a second.
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Like what? So I want to get now to like the comeback. So your addiction progresses pretty bad. You're homeless. You're now out on your own. You're living in a doghouse. And that was kind of towards the tail end of your addiction. So walk the audience through, like, how were you living in a doghouse? Like, briefly explain that experience and then talk about, like, what happened from there that got you on the path to recovery.
So I would live in sober livings and still be using. That was kind of like my hustle. I would live in these cheap sober livings and I would still be using, and everybody knew it, but I could pass a P test. I had like a foolproof way of passing a P test. So I was living in a sober living and clearly using, didn't have a job. And I was out that night and they called me from the sober living, the owner. And I was with actually the first connect that I had ever met, who was now clean, the guy that I told you he gave me his number. So he had gotten raided and done 18 months and had gotten out, now had like 6 months. And so we were out, it was New Year's Eve, and he was like, take me out to dinner or whatever. Owner of the sober living calls and said, hey, Jeannine, so you left some heroin here on the sink in the bathroom, and I need you to not come back. And I freaked out, of course, and said, you don't know that was my heroin. 8 other women live there. We're all in recovery. I passed a P test this morning. And she said, yeah, you're right. You did pass the P test this morning. That's true. And I don't know how you're doing that. But I tell you what, if you can bring me a blood test, I'll support you to come back. And no one had ever asked me for a blood test before. In the moment, of course, was like, fine, I can do that. I can do that tomorrow. She was like, okay. So we get off the phone and I'm talking to my friend. And I'm going on and on and on. I'm like, hey, give me your phone, because my phone didn't even have internet. I'm like, I need to Google the local hospital logo, and then we need to go to Kinko's, and I need to forge this document. And he had like been my buddy for a long time. He backed me up no matter what. You know what I mean? Like no matter what kind of crazy shit I was saying, he was like, sure, I'll give you a ride to do that. Like the sportive friend, And I'm saying all this stuff, and he's just looking at me. And I said, what? Why are you looking at me like that? What am I supposed to do? I don't want to forge this document. She's making me forge a document. She's making me forge this blood test. I don't want to do this, but what am I supposed to do? Kick outside? I've got 1 Suboxone. I don't want to kick outside. What am I supposed to do? And he said, you could get clean. And I don't know why. And I always include that because so many people had said that to me, right? Obviously. And I don't know why, but something about him in that moment saying that to me, I stopped for a second and thought I guess I could do that, right? Like, I guess that would be easier, I'm working so hard to stay a homeless heroin addict, 34. Like, I went to college. What am I doing? So it went in the vault, but I wasn't ready to get clean that night. So the next day I called a connect of mine, a heroin connect, and he was like, hey, what are you doing? And I was like, oh, I got kicked out of my sober living. I don't know where I'm going to go. And he said, well, I got a place you can stay. Where? He said, you can stay in the doghouse in my backyard. And I said, really? Okay, yeah, I'll do that. Can I really? And he was like, totally. Yeah, come on over. Place is yours. So my friend, of course, didn't want to do this, but brought me to like the alley where the guy's backyard was. And it was kind of like a shed thing, like a little small shed that his dog would go in and out of. It had a dog bed on the ground and like a blanket on it. And that was how I ended up like living in that shed. And it was January of 2015. And I stayed there for 3 nights. And the last night, my friend that I lived with, that I had stolen things from a few years prior, called me. And he would, when he was back from Afghanistan, because he's a Marine, he would always like try to look me up and find me. And I would be God knows where, but he always cared, And at this point, my ex had been out of my life for a while. So he called and said, hey, what are you doing? I'm back. I'm in 29 Palms. And I said, I am living in a doghouse in Oceanside. And I think I'm going to die. And he said, okay, I'm going to come get you tomorrow. And I had like this compact with a light on it. I'm picking my face all night. The guy's just bringing me heroin. I've got the same old dirty used needle I've been using for 3 days. I'm smoking meth, doing crossword puzzles, living in the shed, freezing. There was a donut shop where I used the bathroom. So there's a Burger King nearby, and he asked me to meet him at the Burger King. And I went. And I include this part too because I think it's important. I called my mom on the way, and she was on her way to church, and she met me. And my parents, they didn't give me anything when I was using, right? Like if I wanted help finding a detox, my mom would help me with resources, but there was no money for me. There was no cash for me. She had started paying for a phone, but that was for her because she would get nervous about where I was, right? When she couldn't find me. So anyway, she meets me at the Burger King, and I wanted $5 for a pack of cigarettes, which she refused to give me. She wouldn't even give me $5. And my friend came out and got me. 29 Palms is like an hour and a half from here. Drove me out to 29 Palms, and I kicked heroin for the last time. And yeah, with nothing. And I had done detoxes before. This was just a couch. I did have one Suboxone, and I kicked for the last time.
Wow. It's a crazy story. So like while you were homeless, then I guess you would try to get yourself into certain sober livings and stuff like detoxes, like throughout that process to try to kick. And then you would eventually get kicked out because you would just start using again.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. That was the pattern.
And then the kind of like the last time it seems like was it when you got kicked out of that one sober living where the person kind of called your bluff, I guess, if you will. And then you're living in this doghouse, and then now you've got reconnected with this guy and your mom. How did you start to rebuild your life from a place where you were, you had just mentioned that you thought you were going to die. Like, how did you start to embark on this journey to get yourself well?
So, the process of that, looking back, and it can keep you mired in addiction for longer, right? Because I didn't even have an ID. I hadn't used my social security number in years. Like, there was no way to prove I was even a person. Like, my mom at one point was like, well, we can go to social security and I can swear an affidavit that I gave birth to you on this day in Orlando, and maybe we can prove that you're a human, but while I was at my friend's house. And this is the other thing that comes from, I used to see my relapses as such failures, but I came to learn that every time we try to get clean again, we meet more people and we get more resources, right? And this was one of those times when my trying in the past paid off. I had lived at this one sober living multiple times. I'd been kicked out of it both times for selling heroin on the property, but it was the same owner. And I begged him for another chance. And, he waffled about it for a little bit. And of course I had to pee clean and all that stuff. And they'd come up with this system to try to beat me, where they had this long coat hanger, and they would put the pee cup on the end and hold it under me like this. And I would have to drop my pants and spin around in a circle and have my hands up and just try to catch it. And so they'd come up with all these ways to try to catch me how I'm beating the test. So I had to pee clean, went back to sober living. While I was there, I had done one thing right before I got kicked out of that sober living. I would always go on Craigslist and look at people that were hiring spin teachers and just look and just see, because throughout my addiction, the thing that I was the most sad about actually, was thinking that I was never going to teach again. That I was the most sad about. My dad, and that I was never going to teach spin again. It broke my heart. And I would just look on other people's phones at all the studios that were hiring, and sometimes I'd send them my resume and they would, of course, get back to me because I taught at the Beverly Hills Country Club and Rancho Valencia Resort. I had this amazing resume from while I was just doing coke and drinking. But I had sent this person in Encinitas, which is a little bit south of where I was. I had sent her an email. I was strung out, but I sent an email anyways and asked if I could audition. She scheduled me at the time, but I was still using, so I couldn't go. And I got kicked out of sober living like the next day. So when I got to that sober living, I thought, I wonder if that girl would see me again, where I sent the thing. So I reached back out to her and said, hey, and I had made up some lie about why I couldn't make it. And I said, I'm back. I would love to audition for you again if you're interested.
So you get kicked out of a sober living. You end up auditioning for a spin studio and you didn't get the job, you said?
No, I did. So I didn't make the audition. I mean, I didn't go. I didn't physically make it.
Okay.
So right
got
before I got kicked out of the sober living, I had emailed her and set something up, but I was still using it on my bicycle and I didn't actually go. But I did text her and say, hey, I'm sorry, I can't make it. So then when I came back, I reached back out and said, hey, I'm back. Can I audition? And that was the studio that I just sold that I ended up owning 4 years later. So she said, yeah, come audition. So I auditioned and they started me with one class on Saturday. And I taught my first class there with 19 days off of heroin, took the bus there, taught a half spin, half bar class. And within a few weeks, that class was selling out. And they started adding more and more classes for me to the schedule, built my schedule up to 16 classes. Throughout this time, I'm doing all the recovery things, right? The 12-step recovery things, mating. I've had this sponsor for years that I love. And I just started the studio and the classes and the women that I met helped me put my life back together, which is why I appreciate that you recognizing that from the top of this interview and asking about the studio, because it's huge. It's why I stayed clean. I'm getting emotional thinking about it. Because I was so embarrassed. I had these old clothes and it's a really affluent area. I had never heard of Spotify or Instagram. And the owner, who became my friend, was like, hey, so what are you using for your music? And I had an old iPod that didn't even go online. And she was like, are you buying iTunes? And I was like, yeah. And she was like, okay, so, you could just use Spotify. And I was like, I don't know what that is. So she showed me Spotify and she showed me Instagram. And I started teaching classes and nobody mentioned my clothes. She became my very good friend, and she told me later, I asked her about it, and she was like, I mean, I kind of noticed you were a little scraggly, but you were so, you were talented, so I didn't really care. And that was how I did it. At 7 months, a client gave me a car, which is crazy. I'd been saving up some money. I had $1,000 saved, and of course, you can't get a car with $1,000. And a client from that studio gave me a car. And then I was able to start getting more teaching jobs, right? And making more money. I stayed in my sober living for a year and, just started putting it back together like that, with that studio as the foundation really of my life.
Right. And it seems that you coming in there and being welcomed for who you were and having this community of people that it seemed in a way didn't judge you, didn't look at you as you were somebody different. They just accepted you for who you were. And then combine that with your now newfound passion for wanting to turn your life around and also your skill of being a spin instructor for some time. It seemed like it was this perfect storm in a good way to kind of take your recovery to the next level because you had a great group of people, you were making some healthy money, you're doing something that you liked, and you're starting to rebuild your health as well. How did you then work your way up into having a more serious role at that studio to where you got to the point where you ended up buying it?
So pretty quickly, within 6 or 7 months, and that's why I'll always be grateful to the couple that owned it that I bought it from. They invited my opinion because I had taught at other studios before. Anytime I would get clean, I'd get 90 days here and there. I would start teaching somewhere and then I would just relapse. And I don't know what about this particular studio was different, right? Well, I do know the people were different, but they early on really welcomed my opinion. So I rose to a level of importance pretty quickly. I helped them run challenges. They were also a bit newer to the studio scene. They didn't really know how to run one. They kind of did, but not really. And I did, because I had been teaching in these really nice places. Like little things, like they didn't have music playing at the beginning. They had the overhead lights on in the spin room. You wouldn't do that. So little things like that from early on. I was very important to them pretty soon. So that happened quickly. And I was essentially what you would call like a lead instructor, right? And I also, and this is a huge part of this, at about 3 years, I met my husband at a meeting of Heroine Anonymous, at a 12-step meeting. And so we got together, we got married. And while we were actually on our honeymoon, the owners decided that they kind of immediately wanted to get out of the studio. They had a bunch of reasons for that, but they wanted to get out. So the moment we got back from our honeymoon, they approached me about buying it, taking it over, and they were really kind of desperate to get out. So the price was very good, right? The price was very, very, very good. And we were able to get a loan to buy it because it was low enough that we were able to do that. And so that's what happened. And it was just kind of that. And because the members already knew me and trusted me, there wasn't a lot of, now I changed the name and I rebranded it. They ran into a little bit of trouble. That's why they kind of wanted to get out. So I felt like I needed to change the name, which I did. So I rebranded it Studio Cybrid, which is what it is now. But that's how that happened.
It's crazy.
I know, it's insane.
It's insane, right? You were 19 days off heroin when you taught your first class, and then you end up owning it?
Yes, I know. It's so crazy. And one of the reasons really that I wanted to, because the negotiations were very difficult. By then, our relationship had deteriorated a little bit. And I'm fine with the girl now, the woman. But escrow was very difficult. And negotiations were very, very, very difficult. And one of the things I just kept praying for was, I want to be able to tell people that story. I want to be able to tell people what you just said. Because living in a doghouse, if I had seen me now and heard me say, yep, I was there too, and now I own this business, like so much of why I wanted it for the members and because I love it, but I also really wanted to be able to share that that's a possibility, you know?
Yeah. Obviously, I think at this point, your family was probably pretty proud of you from going from where you were to where you are at this point, now owning the studio. And like you said, your mom was the one who really knew most of what was going on to a certain extent with your addiction. And your dad was kind of, in the dark about it a little bit. What was that initial conversation like with your dad? As somebody that you admired, he was your best friend, like how did that go?
So, oh my gosh. So it was the first time that I was homeless after the car was impounded. And either my mom or my brother decided to tell him what was going on. And I'd been begging them not to, just like in LA. And I'm so grateful that I have someone in my life like this. Like, if he says it, I do it. It's over. It's over, And like in LA, the last day that I would not leave LA, I was dying and I wouldn't leave. And he called me one day, I would not leave, and said, Neener, which is what he calls me. He was like, you're still my daughter. And I feel like you're like dying. And at that moment, I was looking in the mirror and my nose started bleeding. And I said, I think I am too. And he was like, that's it. Today you leave. You're done. Your mother gets there today with a truck and you leave. And I left LA that day and never to return right after he said that, and we have that, I love him and I trust him and I respect him. And they kind of know that, right? My mom and my brother. So they're like, look, we got to get like the big guns involved here. This is bullshit. So I was homeless for the first time and I didn't have a phone. And he texted my ex, tell my daughter to call me. And we were in this like crack house. So this guy it was like a cell phone store that was out of business and we'd broken in. And I was in this like cinder block room. And my ex looked at me and he was like, your dad wants you to call him. And I was like, oh my God. So I called him. And he said, are you really, I'm hearing this and I don't believe this. Are you on heroin? Is this real? And I said, yeah, it is. It is. It is, And it was like, even right now, it was crazy to think about. And that's why though, because once he got involved, then we started finding like a detox because I wasn't going to go. And he was like, all right, so what do we do? And then that's when they actually, and I'm so lucky, they did send me to a detox once, and they told me that they would never do it again, and they didn't. But they did send me to that one. And even on the way there, I started changing my mind, and I was trying to jump out of the car while we were driving. And my mom called my dad, and they don't speak, but they spoke during this time. And my mom called my dad, and I remember she was like, Mark, she's saying she doesn't want to go. And I was like, don't call him. And I'm trying to jump out of the car. And she was like, she's saying she doesn't want to go. Okay. And she was like, Jeannine, just talk to your dad. And I got on the phone. I'm probably not going to be able to get through this without crying, but I wasn't going to go anymore. And he said, hey, why don't you want to go? And I said, because I'm going to get sick. Because, you get sick. And he was like, I thought we were sending you to the place, though, where they do the medication. He meant Suboxone. I thought that that's where you were going. We found this place. And I was like, yeah, you did. But you have to wait 24 hours first. You have to wait 24 hours first. And he said, okay, I need you to do me a favor. Look at your mother. I said, my mom. And he was like, she's supposed to be at work right now. She is driving all over San Diego to save you and has been going nonstop to save you. He said, she was in labor with you for 24 hours before you even started to come out. She gave you that 24 hours. I need you to give her 24 hours. And I thought, okay, okay, all right, okay. And then he said, he was like, if I could go in there and do it for you, I would, but I can't. And then he quoted a Jackson Browne lyric because he's a big classic rock fan. And he said, there's a Jackson Browne lyrics that I love, which is that in the end, we all have a dance that we have to do alone. And he was like, this is your dance. You have to do this alone. And you're going to come out on the other side of it a different person. And I would do it for you if I could, but I can't. This is your dance. And I went, and I probably wouldn't have gone if we hadn't had that conversation. So by then, he fully knew what was happening.
Well, I appreciate your vulnerability and kind of getting emotional and real. I think it's going to resonate with people who are listening to this. I think people, whether they've struggled with addiction or not, I think people have had these conversations where they're talking to somebody that they love and they care about, and they have to have a hard conversation, whether it's somebody who's on the side of giving the hard conversation or somebody on the other side who's like receiving what that person is saying. And it just also goes to show that as much as people on the outside want to fix you, want you to get clean, want you to get sober, want you to stop doing that thing that you're doing, you had to be the one to say, I've had enough.
I've had enough, right? And it was years later, by the way. This was the first detox. That was in 2011. And that's also what I try to tell, family members that are struggling. It was years later before I actually finally did,
But I guess you agree that it has to be the person that experiences enough pain. There's not going to be no parent, no matter how much they want to try and do everything for their kid to help them get clean. It has to be that person.
Absolutely. Because like I said, I hero worship this man, if I could have done it for him, I would have, but yeah, you're right. It does. I got to the point where, cause this shouldn't have even worked. I'd done it so many times, my mom told me the previous owners of the studio, she met them early on and she said, I felt so bad for them because I knew you were just going to relapse and leave again, and I was like, no, I know, that's fair. And so I don't even know why this particular time worked. And that's why I tell people don't stop trying. There was no reason to believe. I didn't even think it would work. I just wanted to not be in that doghouse anymore. I was freezing cold, I didn't even know if it would work,
Right. Yeah, because you just never know where that next step is going to take you. You never know where that next introduction is going to take you. You never know where that next job or how it's going to make you feel, or how you might have a mindset shift from whatever you experience in that moment or in that day, and how that could end up just leading you to another mindset shift, another moment, or you end up getting inspired and saying, you know what, I believe in myself enough that I've had this job now for 2 weeks and I haven't used, maybe I'm going to start going into a 12-step meeting. Maybe I'm going to start working on myself. Maybe I'm going to start doing some other things to clean my life up. And to bring it all back full circle, I think this is all coming together kind of beautifully. So we've talked about your journey with the studio. We've talked about how much meaning it's had to you and why selling the studio has been so challenging for you from a mental, emotional, spiritual level, right? We talked about your story and how your addiction progressed, what events triggered the addiction, and then how that led you to this rock bottom moment to beginning to work at this studio. So I guess the last thing I want to talk to you about is how have you reconciled with this divorce? Like, I know you've talked about that this has been something that you've obsessed over for quite some time, and it really like rocked your world. What have you done to get to a place, like a level of almost acceptance, forgiveness, whatever it is, to now have that be something that is just a part of your journey and not necessarily something that's weighing your journey down?
Radical accountability and responsibility for my addiction. And that came about this last time because I blamed other people for my using. I blamed my ex, and I didn't really blame my parents as people, but like the divorce and how I was sad. And this time it got very clear to me that I was responsible for my addiction. And lots of people's parents gets divorced and they don't end up shooting heroin over it, right? And when I look at me and when I feed in all of the things that I know about myself from when I was a kid and these choices that I was making early on, and step back and say like, okay, yeah, their divorce was really sad. Their divorce is unrelated to my drug use. And I believe that. And I know you and I have had some conversations about this off air, but I believe their divorce is unrelated to my using. Did it maybe prompt me to use a little sooner? Maybe, sure, maybe. But I can release any blame around that because it's unrelated, And I also, just on a strategic way too, or like a tool way, I guess, seeing my people as parents. Seeing my parents as people versus just my parents, right? The role of my parents, and seeing why the divorce was actually right for both of them. And they were doing the best that they could at the time for everybody involved. That has allowed a lot of that stuff to kind of fade away. And it's like, I almost forget how sad I was sometimes, I'm also in the same way that I am so grateful for my heroin addiction. And you've heard me speak to this a little bit. When I was just drinking and doing coke, I could have done that forever. I could have had that half-life forever, where I was just getting by. I had a job, I had a car, that's fine. But there was no real progression in my life. Heroin brought me to my knees and forced me to make a choice of, for me, sobriety, abstinence, 12-step, and life, right? It forced me to make a choice. And my life is so much better now after experiencing the pain of that addiction. And the same thing with my parents' divorce. Prior to that, like you said, I don't even, maybe sheltered a little bit, but like, I didn't have a lot of like life experience, right? And I believe that the heights of our joy is directly related to the depths of our pain. And that was like the first lifetime, painful experience that people all go through them. And that was just my first one, and I got through it. But primarily taking responsibility for my use, because like in my last rehab, I remember I would cry all the time about how I missed my dad. I miss my dad and I wish it was the way it was. And I was sitting there and I had this revelation where I was like, okay, really, dude? You love and respect this man so much, but you won't stop doing the one thing he really wants you to stop doing? False. Not true. You can't sit here and say that you love and respect this man so much while you continue to shoot heroin. And separating those two things and understanding that this can happen and it's sad, but I'm making choices over here. That's kind of how, I don't know if that answered your question, but that's how I was able to let that go. Just radical accountability and responsibility for my choices, my addiction.
Right. Yeah, and that's totally important to take 100% responsibility, accountability, and just know that you can't continue to blame your circumstances for all the bad choices that you might make as a result. I guess like what I was more asking, and you kind of answered this, is the choices you made in response to the divorce, like made your life so much worse than maybe it needed to be. I was just more like looking at it from a relational aspect of like how you have come to terms with that just their divorce was not your fault. Like their divorce was not personal for you, like, and how you've maybe like released some of the anger or sadness like towards that it seems just really took over your life for some time.
I think fortunately I was old enough that I know kids thinking it was their fault is pretty common. I think I was old enough that I didn't think that. I didn't think it was my fault. I thought it was my mom's fault. and fully. And as I've gotten older and I've gotten to know her better, and as I've matured, I've understood that that's not true. And I've been able to see it more, again, like I said, as them as people, and not just as my mom and my dad, but who they are and the totality of their lives and where they're from. And I've been able to see why it happened, and it makes sense, you know, and they're both really happy now. And I think that was a huge piece of it, was getting so much closer to my mom and seeing her as a more realistic, empathetic, loving person in my life. I was held up around that for a long time. But yeah, I don't know if that's a great answer. And there's still some, like, I think all kids, your parents are divorced, right? I think all kids are like, it's still kind of sad, right? Like Christmas and stuff, it's kind of sad, but not the way that it was,
Right. I think it's important in my experience as well that you come to this level of understanding and acceptance that your parents aren't necessarily quote unquote inherently bad people because they get divorced, right? And as you get older and as you begin to work on yourself, you begin, like you said, to have some empathy and understand more about them and their situation. And you figure that they were just doing the best they could at the time with the tools that they had. And yeah, I think you have obviously come to a place where you're well past that and you've come a long way. And I think your story is amazing, given what you've been through and how your life was nearly over. It seems like a lot. So, Jeannine, this has been amazing. I'm so glad that we got to unpack your story on the show from start to finish. If people want to connect with you, if they want to listen to your podcast, if they want to find out more about what you do, like, where's the best place for them to do that?
Well, thank you so much. You're very good at what you do. This is one of the best interviews I've ever had. You're thorough and you obviously care, and thank you so much. You're insightful. I just appreciate it so much. So the way to find me, my podcast is Chasing Heroine with an E, like female hero, Chasing Heroine. And my social media is Chasing Heroine as well, TikTok, Instagram, all the platforms, or my personal Instagram, which is Jeannine Coulter. But Chasing Heroine would be the best place to start.
Sweet. Well, I will make sure to include the links to that stuff in the show notes. And I also appreciate your kind words. Like, I love being able to help unpack stories like this on the podcast. I think people, they need to hear these stories. They need to understand like the progression of addiction and maybe like what might lead to it, like what might keep people in it, the trials and tribulations that go along with it, like what's the day-to-day like, and how eventually somebody pulls themselves out of this. Because I think it's important for people to understand that they can help pull the person out, but they can't fully pull them out. They can get them out a little bit, and maybe they force them into some sort of rehab or treatment or whatever, but it's up to that person once they get in there to make that decision to change, right?
Right. Yeah. You can assist people along the way with resources. This is the last thing I'll say, because I think my mother really got to a place where she had it kind of dialed in on the best way to help me, if anybody is listening that's ever in the situation that she was in. So she would not ever give me cash, ever, or, she wouldn't give me things, but she would, if I wanted to go into a detox, she would help me put together resources, because she knew that I didn't have the mental faculties from day-to-day homeless living to like be calling for beds and going on wait lists and calling every day. And that's pretty true, right? The average homeless addict doesn't have like the bandwidth left to start calling facilities. It's a challenging system to navigate, even for someone that's sober and clear-headed and has clinical experience with it like she does. So that's where she got with helping me. And they always supported me once I landed somewhere. My dad always talked to me all the time. He wrote me in jail. They were super supportive at all my stages.
It's inspiring that, given everything that you went through and then given all the, I'm sure, the stress and the anxiety that you may have indirectly caused them, that no matter what, they still stuck by your side in the best way that they knew how to. And I think that's important for people to hear. So once again, Jeannine, this has been awesome. I will link your stuff in the show notes. And for those listening, what I invite you to do is to share a takeaway. Maybe it was something that Jeannine said about her childhood and how her childhood like kind of progressed and how that eventually like led to her, kind of dropping out of college, moving to LA, and then how that led to her addiction progressing. Maybe it was something that she said about her experience as somebody who was heavily addicted to drugs for some time. Maybe that was something that maybe resonated with you or maybe a loved one. Maybe it was something that she said about the importance of her studio and how that's been something that's been so meaningful to her, or perhaps her path forward and her path out. Whatever it was, share your takeaway, tag Jeannine, tag myself, because we'd love to hear your feedback. And we once again thank you for listening to this episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst. We'll see you next time.